Werewolf of Lake Monroe. My brother and I went on a fishing trip to Monroe Lake in Indiana. We've been there hundreds of times and explored all over the place. We left on a Friday morning and got there late that afternoon. We brought a John boat and some basic essentials like a tent, my gun, and some firewood. We didn't bring much food, thinking we'd just eat fish and maybe some small game if needed. We loaded everything into the boat and took off before it got dark. The only lights we had were the ones on the boat and a small flashlight. After being on the water for about an hour, we found a small cove. It was perfect because it was in the middle of nowhere, so we could do anything we wanted. We unloaded the boat and set up camp. My brother got a fire going, and I started to fish because I was hungry. After a few minutes, I realized there were no sounds at all. No crickets, no rustling, nothing. I wasn't getting any hits on my fishing rig either. I gave up and started walking back to the camp, which was set up about 20 yards from the boat. When I got back to my brother, I asked him if he noticed the lack of nature sounds. He replied, "No, didn't pay much attention to it." Then we heard it, a loud howl, sounding like it was about a mile away. It sent chills down my spine. My brother began to shake. I said, "What the heck are we doing? We're both grown men. It was probably just a coyote." He agreed with a nod, and we decided to lay down in the tent and call it a night. But I got my gun out just to be safe, because that sound was really close. The next morning, we woke up and got the day started. We thought we'd see if we could find footprints or a scat trail from the coyote we heard last night. We ventured about half a mile into the woods from our camp. Before long, we found something, a very large, very dead coyote that had been ripped apart. It was only 2 feet off the game trail. My brother was fascinated, trying to figure out what could have done this. I, however, was more interested in going back to camp. We returned to camp, and I texted my dad asking what sort of big predators could take down a coyote and do that to it, especially out here in Indiana. My dad replied, "Can't think of anything more than a cougar, but that's unlikely." I figured it might have been another coyote fighting for territory. We decided to stay just one more night. Neither of us wanted to encounter whatever could have done that. We went out on the boat for a while to fish. We had no luck in that cove, so we made it to this rock face we called our crappie honey hole, because we always caught crappie there. We fished until the sun began to set, then called it a good day. Hungry, we headed back to camp. This little boat didn't go very fast, but it was better than a canoe or kayak. By the time we got back to camp, it was dark and the moon was high. Once again, it was very quiet. We slid the boat onto the bank and made our way to the fire pit to cook some of our catch. That's when we discovered our campsite. It looked like a war zone. Everything was torn up and thrown around like someone or something was looking for something or somebody. We both grabbed our guns, took the safeties off, and looked at each other with the same expression. Time to go. We didn't even grab anything. Just as we started making our way to the boat, we heard it. A deep, gurgling growl in the distance. When we got to the boat, my brother grabbed a flashlight and pointed it towards the camp. We both stopped, terrified, trembling all over. The light revealed 2 big yellow eyes about a foot off the ground. I started backing up. My brother jumped in the boat and started the motor. I followed him, but I didn't want to take my eyes off whatever this thing was. As I climbed in the boat, I looked away for just a second. When I looked back up, it was gone. We got about 20 yards out into the water, and I used the light again to look for that creature. Then I saw those same eyes coming out of the darkness. They began to come to the edge of the water. This thing looked like a wolf, but not exactly. It walked over to the water on all fours, but once there, it stood up on two legs. It reached a height of over 6 feet. We then heard it howl. I pointed the flashlight right at it. Then it looked as if it had a piece of our tent clutched in its hand or paw. I moved my brother out of the way and put the throttle on high, even though the part of the lake we were at was an idle zone only. But we had to leave as quickly as we could. We got back to the boat ramp area, got the boat loaded on the trailer, and then we booked it. We didn't talk one bit all the way home, and we never said anything to Mom or Dad, though I'm sure they were wondering where the heck our tent and cooler went. I'm in my 30s now. I haven't been back to Monroe Lake since. To be honest, I'm scared to, and I warn people who are going there to be very careful. Werewolf by the pond. I'm a 21-year-old woman who lives in a log cabin down a dead-end road in the middle of the countryside. I've lived here my entire life, so this life is what I know best. I have about 3 neighbors. This is important, as it will take place around my closest neighbor's property. I wanted to tell this story because this neighbor has since passed. She was a Spitfire Italian woman who drank beer and ate raw garlic with every meal. She passed at the ripe old age of 98 and was the kindest and toughest soul you'd ever meet. For context, I live in southern Illinois, close to the border of Missouri and Kentucky, so you can gauge the landscape I'm surrounded by. You've probably guessed, but I'm bordered in by a large cornfield to my back and miles of woods spanning into the next town over. I've always enjoyed the scenery around me. It feels tranquil most of the time. However, this is the countryside. There's bound to be weird occurrences every now and again. One thing I can say confidently is that I have absolutely no explanation for what happened to me when I was 16. I'll preface this by saying I've faced many larger animals. One time I was within 10 feet of a black bear in Tennessee. There was even one known to have broken free from a traveling train circus that ran through the area. The old train tracks and shack are still in the woods just a mile from my house. The bobcats I chased out of my driveway are no threat. Same with the coyotes that yelped outside my window most nights. Even the cougar that my dad had to shoot at to scare it off the property when I was younger wasn't nearly as scary as this thing, which I so clearly encountered. To paint you a picture leading up to that day, I'll start with what I heard a few days prior. It was the weekend. I remember this because, usually, my dad would not ask me to drive after dark. Most of us don't here due to the volume of deer and lack of street lamps, and especially if I had school the next day. I had to drive him to the store and still have to because he has a condition where he cannot drive himself. I'd begged him to make his famous chili, and he agreed to make it later in the week if he had the groceries. When we arrived home, the sun had just set, and as I was grabbing the last few bags out of the trunk, I heard it. This was not a coyote. I've heard every sound they make: yelping, crying, howling, fighting, whatever it may be. But I can tell you, this howl I heard, it was a singular howl, and it was very deep. But worst of all, it was close. It came from the cornfield behind my house, which starts around 10 feet from where I stood. I shot my head up and looked at my dad. He was wide-eyed, a man who I know to not be afraid of dang near anything. But now he had an expression of pure terror on his face. He turned to me and almost ripped the door off its hinges, whispery yelling at me to run inside. That night, we both sat in the living room in silence. He even changed the TV from his normal cryptid-centered shows to Pawn Stars. We tried to think if there could somehow be wolves in the area passing through, but came up with nothing. We decided to call it a coy wolf, a coyote and wolf hybrid, and forget about it. However, we both knew there was no chance it was this far south without being spotted somewhere. Either by hunters, farmers, or in the towns. But fear does play mind games. I will say I forgot about this for a few days. I was focused on my exams coming up in school at the time. I remember because I had to wake up earlier to go in and prepare for testing, which is exactly what happened on my last testing day before winter break. It was foggy that morning. I was thinking of going out and feeding the chickens. I pulled my blinds to look out at their coop and see if their solar door had come up yet. Mind you, the sunrise barely touched the tree stumps, and the fog made it even darker out there. I went to put on my coat and was going to see if the elderly neighbor I mentioned had fed her also very old dog. I figured my barn cats also needed some breakfast, so I headed outside before leaving for school. After feeding and loving on my cats, I headed for the chicken coop. As I walked around my dad's pole barn, I saw it. It was by my neighbor's pond. At first I thought it was her, but or maybe her fishing gear, or even her lawnmower. I'm telling you, every possible option ran through my mind first, until it began to move. A stray dog would be the most plausible explanation, but what stray dog is that huge? It had to have been 2 beefy Irish wolfhounds stacked on top of each other in a black fur suit. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. I stopped dead in my tracks, hiding behind a stack of wooden pallets behind the pole barn. I didn't even have a weapon nearby. I felt myself fade out for a second, before gaining the courage to look again, hoping it had not made its way to me during that time. I peeked out again, but I was very sure now of what I was looking at. An extremely large wolf. I'd grown up hearing locals talk about large black dogs sighted in backyards and appearing on trail cams, but never did I think I would see one in person. This thing was massive. Compared to a brick sign with the pond name on it, my chin would be right at the top of the sign. The creature was easily almost at that height, just with its shoulders. The first part of it I could make out was the higher hind legs. Its back sloped down to slightly shorter front legs, but bulky shoulders. Its muscles were obvious through its fur. This is still the visual ingrained into my memory to this very day. I felt as if I was just waiting for the turn towards me. The curiosity, along with fear to identify the creature, gnawed at my mind. I was so pumped with adrenaline I wanted to run, but I wanted to know for sure if it was truly there, and not just in my head. After all, it was very early, and maybe I was just tired, I thought. I started gaining my sense of reality back and realized my neighbor's dog had been barking the entire time. This is a blind and deaf dog, so this is a blind and deaf dog, so he knew something, smelled something, was there. I guess this was bothersome to that creature. It started to turn back towards the deepest part of the woods. It lifted its head, and I saw the light bounce off its eyes and wet nose. I watched it lick its chops. The fangs on this wolf made my heart sink. It could easily charge me, and if it did, I would be done for in seconds. Fight or flight kicked in at that point, and I hightailed it back to my room. I sat on my floor, staring out the window, watching it become consumed by the trees. I must have sat there waiting for almost an hour because, before long, my mom came to see if I was up for school. I didn't tell her what I saw. Instead, I asked her to check on my neighbor with my dad later today. Of course, she was confused by that request, but she sent me off to school with a promise that she would. I came home early that day. I ran into the house as fast as I could to be sure everyone was still there and alive. I remember my dad having a strange look, but he smiled at me after saying my neighbor was okay. He got that strange look back again after my mom left the room and told me there was a coyote carcass by the pond. I told him to point out my window at where exactly they found it. He pointed perfectly to where I'd seen that wolf creature. I then explained everything I saw out of pure fear, and he looked as if he already knew what I was talking about. I became very paranoid about leaving doors or windows unlocked, checking the property at night when everyone was asleep, and I even researched late into the night about what else this could possibly have been. But nothing added up. Eventually, as time passed, I forgot about it for the most part. I would only give it a thought when Dad's shows would mention wolf-like creatures. I heard some variation of the same howl I'd heard a couple of times after that in the passing months, but I was just glad it sounded farther away until it finally stopped. Of course, I'm still a bit creeped out to go outside at night, and I've been having recurring nightmares of this creature that I've deemed a werewolf. Some might say it can't be because it didn't stand up, but I believe if it didn't feel eyes on it, it most definitely would have. This thing was much bigger than a wolf. I pushed it to the back of my mind for as long as I could, but eventually I wanted to share this experience, instead of holding it back, trying to bury it deep down. However, out of fear of being called a liar, it took me some time. I've recently been having nightmares of werewolves nearly every night, and I felt it was time to share at last. I don't know if the creature will make its return, but I'm hoping it stays far away.
That's the end of the story. If you have hooked up till here, then hit like button and comment down your views. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then do support me by subscribing, so you may not miss any video in future.